والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وبعد. We begin in the name of Allah Azza wa Jal by asking Him to send peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. May His peace and blessings be upon him and his family. As you all know, we are in the midst of Surah Aal-Imraan. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought us to verse number 105 today. And 105 is actually a continuation of the previous verses. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, actually commands us in verse number 103, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. Hold firmly to the rope of Allah Azza wa Jal altogether. Hold firmly to that rope. And as we discussed, there's different interpretations about what the rope of Allah Azza wa Jal is. The Quran, Islam, the Prophet ﷺ's message, all of which, of course, we know is virtually the same in what it's brought. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse number 104, after commanding us to hold fast to the rope of Allah, He says, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةً يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَلَى الْمُنْكَرِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Let there be a group from amongst you, a nation inviting to all that is good, enjoining what is right, and forbidding what is wrong. Those are the ones who are successful. And the Mufassirin, they spend a bit of time going into those who call to goodness, right? Ma'ruf and munkar, and distinguishing between the two. And that this ummah is the one that is to call towards goodness and to forbid from evil. In fact, Imam Sahib Webb, Hafidhullah, he once said that one of his teachers told him, if you could take the entire message of the Prophet ﷺ and condense it into one sentence, it would be that the Prophet ﷺ was sent to protect people from harm and to enjoin them towards good. That's his entire mission. His entire mission was to protect us from harm and to show us the good, to enjoin us in what is good. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes that clear, that this is our job. And so traditionally, when Muslims moved into other non-Muslim communities or societies, they didn't just take a back seat, right? They didn't just say, okay, you know what, let those disbelievers do whatever they want. I'm going to live in my own isolated little world and not worry about anybody else. That was not the sunnah, right? They went out and they tried to change their society for better. They tried to change it so that people saw them as, or at least understood what moral righteousness was, and to bring that forth. And so from there, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then brings us to verse number 105. So He's commanded us to hold fast to the rope of Allah Azza wa Jal and say, let there arise amongst you a nation who is focused on enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. Then He says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, in verse number 105, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ تَفَرَّقُوا وَاخْتَلَفُوا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَهُمُ الْبَيِّنَاتِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ عَظِيمٌ. And do not be like those who became divided and differed after the clear proofs had come to them. And those will have a great punishment. Who are those that became divided after the clear proofs had come to them? The Mufassirin, they spend some time looking at or describing these people. And many of them, they've come to the conclusion that it was the previous generations that were given books. This is the Jews and the Christians and others that were given books that had prophets that were brought to them, but they changed the message over time. And they started to argue about what was in the book and what was not in the book. And one thing that's made very clear is that they didn't do this out of guidance, but because they had their own desires. They wanted to change the religion from something that Allah had commanded to something that their own whims and desires wanted. And so as they went on, they would argue and they'd have argumentation with one another, and eventually they would change whatever it was to suit their desire. And so here it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, don't be like those people. When the command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes, then don't differ amongst them and try and argue and try and say, okay, well, maybe this is it, or maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meant something else, or whatever it is. What was the hallmark of the Sahaba? Was that when they heard a message from the Prophet ﷺ, they said, وَاسْمِعْنَا وَأَطَعْنَا. We have heard and we obey. We've heard the message, we hear you, and we obey. Right? That was their motto. And yet, over time, people have lost that. And they're trying to go through, gymnastics and acrobatics in terms of literary senses to try and justify what their own hearts desire. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the scholars, there are a lot of differences of opinions. So I know you might be asking, well, how is that possible? How is it that if it's so clear that the scholars have differed? And this is very interesting, because the Mufassirin, they mention about this. They talk about those who, once you have defined the khair and the ma'ruf, then you have some difference of opinion within what is ma'ruf and what is khair. So in other words, there's boundaries that the Sharia has put out. Right? As long as you don't cross those boundaries, then it's permissible for you to differ about different opinions. And we know that. We see this in our ummah. We see, just look at the ways in which people around the Muslim world pray. There's a difference. Some pray with their hands by their side. Some pray with their hands crossed. Some pray with, saying a certain thing or different. There's a difference in the prayer. Now is that people differing amongst themselves? This is all from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. All of this was within the boundaries of the Sharia. Nobody, for instance, is saying, actually, there's 6 prayers, not 5. That's outside the boundaries of Sharia. Or, what would be more likely, there's 3 prayers, not 5. Or 2 prayers, right? Most people don't want more prayers, they want less. There's nobody that says that. And if they say that, they're outside the boundaries of Sharia, and so therefore, it's not accepted. But within the boundaries of Sharia, you have so much intellectual history from the scholars. Richness, debates about what is permissible. Why? Because they are seeking what is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not what is pleasing to their own hearts and desires. They're not trying to change the word of Allah so that it conforms with what they want. They're trying to determine what is most pleasing to Allah. Perhaps the Prophet ﷺ did things in different ways, but what is most pleasing to Allah? That's their argument. And so as such, they are on that path of differing amongst themselves. And actually, as some of the, subhanAllah, as Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and Qasim ibn Muhammad, they said the difference of opinion amongst the companions is a source of mercy and ease for people. The difference of opinion, because now, depending on your situation or circumstance, you can say, well, I can take this person's opinion, who was also on ma'ruf and khair, who was also within the boundaries of Sharia. Right? And maybe I take somebody else's opinion on something else. And this is why, brothers and sisters, it's so important for us to study with scholars. Scholars who have devoted their lives to understanding what are the boundaries of Sharia. And within those boundaries, what is acceptable and what is permissible. But what is very clear is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to us here, don't be like those who just differed for the sake of their own whims and desires, of their own impulses. Don't be like them, because then they change the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what does He say about them? وَأُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ عَظِيمٌ. They will be the people who have a severe punishment. Severe punishment. They were given guidance and they left it or they changed it. They left it or they changed it. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in the next verse, يَوْمَ تَبْيَضُّ وُجُوهًا وَتَسْوَدُّ الْوُجُوهِ فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ اسْوَدَّتْ وُجُوهُهُمْ أَكَفَرْتُمْ بَعْدَ إِيمَانِكُمْ فَذُوقُوا الْعَذَابَ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ تَكْفُرُونَ. On that day, some faces will turn bright and some will turn dark. As for those whose faces turn dark, it will be said to them, did you disbelieve after your belief? Then taste the punishment of what you used to reject. وَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ ابْيَضَّتْ وُجُوهُهُمْ فَفِي رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. But as for those whose faces will turn bright, they will be within the mercy of Allah, and they will abide therein eternally. What is this darkening and this brightening of faces that's being mentioned here? The Mufassirin, they talk about on Yawm al-Qiyamah that there will be people whose faces will be bright. And they say that they will be bright out of the nur, or the light of faith. These are the people who had, in this world, they were believers. And they did the actions of believers. And so on the day of judgment, they will be shining because of that brightness. They will be in felicity because of that brightness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions here that there are people whose faces will be bright, but at the same time there will be people whose faces will be darkening. And by the way, this has nothing to do with skin color, to be clear. You could have very fair skin and yet be darkened on the day of judgment. Why? Because of a person's disbelief. And you could be very dark-skinned and yet bright on the day of judgment. Why? Because of your belief. So all of this is to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they spent some time talking about bayad and sawad, and the darkening and the brightening of the faces. But one thing that was very interesting in the interpretation was how they mention here that the brightening is mentioned before the darkening. Why? Because Allah's mercy overcomes His wrath. You see that? Allah's mercy is mentioned first. Right? So there is a hopefulness that's there that we will be amongst the people whose faces are brightened on the day of judgment. And then they mention here, of course, that there are also those who they turn back. Their faces are darkened, and they are asked, why did you disbelieve after a clear message had come to you? In other words, this is on you. Allah brought the message, gave you an opportunity, and yet you rejected it, and that's why you are in this state, on this state that you are. Then taste, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَذُوقُوا الْعَذَابِ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ تَكْفُرُونَ. Taste the punishment due to what you used to reject. You used to reject it, and now taste that punishment. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, finally in verse number 107, as I mentioned, وَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ بِيَضَّتْ وُجُوهُهُمْ فَفِي رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ وَهُمْ فِي رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. As for those whose faces will be brightened, they will be within the mercy of Allah. And brothers and sisters, ultimately this is all we want. We just want to be included in the mercy of Allah Azza wa Jal. The Prophet ﷺ was with a group of his companions. And he said, no one of you will enter Jannah by his or her deeds alone. No one of you. Your deeds, no matter how much you pray, no matter how much you fast, no matter how much sadaqah you give, no matter how much of any of these things, you may think that you've done some great goodness, you've engaged in all this ma'ruf and khair. You may think that. But no one of you is going to enter paradise by their deeds alone. And then they said, Ya Rasulullah, not even you? In other words, we get it with us. We're lowly people, but you are the Prophet of God. What about you? And the Prophet ﷺ says, not even me, except for the mercy of Allah. In other words, only due to the mercy am I or you or anybody going to get into Jannah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about that for those who are encompassed by the mercy of Allah, He says what? فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. They will be in there eternally. They will be in there eternally. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from amongst those who have the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those who abide therein eternally. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be amongst those whose faces are brightened on Yawm al-Qiyamah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from being those whose faces are darkened on Yawm al-Qiyamah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the best in this world and in the next world, and protect us from the punishment of the fire. وقولوا قولي هذا جزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. ربنا اغفر لنا ولوالدينا وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب ربنا اغفر لنا ولإخواننا الذين سبقونا بالإيمان ولا تجعل في قلوبنا غلا للذين آمنوا ربنا إنك رؤوف رحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.